up, YouTube? This is Alan. For those of you who were regular subscribers to my channel, I want to apologize. I know I said I was going to do a weekly video or every few weeks, and it's been forever since I did one for a number of reasons. The time involved in editing, the fact that I didn't have very many subscribers, and the fact that some of the stuff that I was doing with this personal brand, I felt it takes a lot of work to do the editing piece. And if I had any other project going on in the same day of doing one of these, I ended up just putting it on the schedule and then not doing it, right? So, you know, and most days I have at least some things to do. So, having said that, we're gonna go ahead and move forward with a quick tip today, and I'm gonna start trying to do these on a regular basis. I know I've said that before, so we'll believe it when it happens. Second point, why am I shooting this in front of the fish tank? Well, it's a nice background, and to be honest with you, I've always got some kind of project going on around the house. So my entire house right now is a disaster area. My office has stuff sitting everywhere. My living room, you know, just worked on the gas logs today. The kitchen's got food out. So I thought, oh, do it in front of the fish tank. It's a nice backdrop. All right, so the first quick tip that I want to go over is something that you may have seen, and if you learned it the way I've learned it, you probably learned it a little wrong, and that's talking about looking at the creatinine level in terms of renal failure. And the way I learned it was just look for a peak and a trough. You know, the high level measured and the low level measured of 0.3 milligrams per deciliters, you know, and you're done. You've got criteria threshold for a query for AKI, but it's a little more complicated than that. Those of you who are familiar with the actual criteria names, you know, there's one that came out in 2012, which is KDIGO, or Kidney Disease Improving Global Outcomes. If you actually sit down and read the paper, what it says is that the timing of when you draw the creatinine or do the blood work really matters in terms of whether you can diagnose it as AKI at one threshold versus another. So there's two timing terms. One is whether it's a prospective measurement, meaning that you know the baseline from previous medical records, or it was hospital acquired and you actually measured the creatinine as it rose and fall. That's a prospective measurement, and it lets you use the lower threshold of 0.3 milligrams. And honestly, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because a high incidence of hospital-acquired AKI is actually ATN. So you're not even, you know, in a lot of cases, because it's AKI tends to signify only a CC level diagnosis and something that's going to probably resolve with IV fluid, and it's not a true intrarenal pathology. But patients in the hospital don't typically get more and more dehydrated. They typically go the other way. We give them more and more fluids. So when you do have a hospital-acquired AKI, a lot of times it's from antibiotic therapy hitting the kidneys, or, you know, IV contrast media, or shock, or a bad intraoperative course, blood loss. They get septic. You know, something happens in the hospital, and then it's not even AKI anyway, because it's an intrarenal. It doesn't respond to IV fluids, and it ends up being a different diagnosis. But if you are observing just a rise and fall of the creatinine, that, you know, something goes up, we make the patient too dry, maybe a CHF patient, and you see a creatinine that we measure on the way up and down and hit the 0.3, that is basically, that's a criteria-based tool to use to diagnose AKI using the CC version of the diagnosis. Now, if the patient comes in and it's a community-acquired AKI, then you have to be more conservative. You don't know what the situation is. This is assuming you don't have a baseline measurement, and you didn't measure it as it rose. You only caught it as it was falling, and you don't know how much it's already fallen before you did the measurement, if you're at the top of that peak or if you're at the bottom. And what the KDIGO consensus paper says is that when you have a it's called a retrospective measurement, meaning you only caught it on the downhill. And what it says is you have to use the old criteria of 1.5 times the baseline. Well, 1.5 times the baseline of what? Well, what it says is you can safely assume the lowest measured serum creatinine retrospectively on the back end as the baseline in the absence of other, you know, history. So, for example, if I measured it at 1.5, it would have to go all the way down to 1.0 before I could call it AKI on a retrospective measurement. So it tends to be that if you have a prospective measurement, then you can be more aggressive. You have the lower creatinine threshold versus a retrospective measurement where you need to have that 1.5 times baseline still. And that can still be very confusing because if you don't know the history, you don't know if there's CKD. And for my intrarenal example, someone who didn't respond to fluids and it looks like they have an intrarenal problem, it could turn out that actually no, they're just at their baseline for CKD. And you kind of do have to have the history to sort that out or observe them for a really long time. Sometimes they go home before that decision is ever determined. The other issue that comes up is when you're doing the retrospective measurement, you end up looking at that peak and then waiting and waiting and waiting for that trough, and they actually go home with it still trending down. So actually they didn't meet the 1.5 times criteria because they were discharged. If you were able to get the outpatient measurement and follow-up, you would have seen, okay, that was actually criteria for AKI. You met the 1.5. You can't report it because it wasn't measured in hospital. Let's see, what are some other challenges that come up with those retrospective measurements? Just having to wait and see and not do that query, resist the urge to do that query. And the other thing is, if they have pre-existing CKD, then that criteria, that creatinine gap, I should say, is really going to widen out. So if their baseline is 1.5 to start with, you're going to have a measured peak of what. All right, sorry about the little jump you just saw there. It's a perfect example of me not doing this in a long time. Right in the middle talking about something and boom, battery died. All right, so what I was saying was, if the person already has CKD, you're going to have a wider gap. So for the patient whose baseline is 1.5 with their creatinine, if that's the lowest measured, turns out that's their baseline, then you're going to have to measure a peak on a retrospective case at, like, what is that? 2.25, something like that, before it hits the 1.5 times baseline. So that means you're not looking at a creatinine threshold of 0.3. You're looking at a creatinine threshold of 0.7, 0.8, right in that range before it would be approved. This is why sometimes I think when you do those queries, you think, well, I've got my 0.3 or 0.4. Why is the doctor not giving me AKI? This is why. This is also why in some cases you think you had a perfectly legitimate AKI diagnosis in the chart just using the 0.3 milligram per deciliter threshold, and it gets denied, by RAC or someone. And it may be that the denial, I'm pretty hard on the auditors, but it may be that the denial is justified using strict interpretation of the KDIGO criteria. But remember, these are just criteria. It is still true that the ultimate decision making, if it's a little higher than that criteria, even a little lower, that should still be up to the physician and not an auditor or not a book or not somebody 500 miles away making a retrospective. I know the commercial insurances have contracts with the hospital that allow them to play those games, but really, if we're being honest, if it's off a little bit, that should still be the purview of the physician to make that final determination, at least in my opinion, even though it goes on even sometimes within the RAC audits. That was a little bit example of the type of a little bit more in-depth conversation that we get into in our Mastering Clinical Concepts bootcamp, which, by the way, we've done now 3 or 4 times, and the feedback we're getting is fantastic. I actually had a RAC auditor come to one of my classes, and the feedback that I got from her was in terms of clinical validity, clinical validation, avoiding denials, not just adding diagnoses, but really avoiding denials, that this course is right on the money, which makes me feel good. We're going to continue to try to improve it, of course, because we've only done it a few times. All right, the next thing I want to bring up, we'll do a question from the mailbag. So next week, Dr. Kennedy is going to be on the show. Love it when he comes on. I always look forward to hearing what he has to say. And it just so happens I'm co-hosting. I got lucky and managed to be home. So one of the questions that came in was, what do you do when you have AFib and the documentation is reflecting hypercoagulopathy or hypercoagulability? Just based on nothing else but the AFib. And what's interesting about it is that it's really not in the medical textbooks, but there is some research. If you're really curious, you can go search this. There's some research that shows, even on the NIH and some other sources, from a hematology standpoint, those clotting factors are in fact more active systemically throughout the whole body, not just getting clots in the in the heart, but they're more likely to clot anywhere because they have more of the clotting factors. It is still controversial. It's not in a lot of research. It's hard to sell. And I can tell you that even though I know that there's some, I don't know who's doing it, there's some queries that are going out, there's some recommendations that are being made to do hypercoagulopathy with AFib, and there's even some evidence to support it. I can tell you that none of us right now at Actis, or at least people that I know, are particularly enthusiastic about going out and recommending that you just start writing queries for hypercoagulopathy for anybody who has AFib. I think it's a little more complex and nuanced than that. It could be valid. I mean, it is still up to the attending physicians, but I don't think I'm going to recommend that you go out and just start automatically placing those queries at this point. I think more research probably needs to be done, and more discussion. But I wouldn't say never. Okay, I will never say that something will never happen. Just like I won't say that something will always happen. Of course, there are exceptions and situations where it could be legitimate. But I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. I know I only have like a grand total of 140 followers, and half of you probably won't see this. Probably 20 of you just signed up because I put a video of my fish tank up last week to see if my YouTube account works. But if you're there, put it in the comments, or come out to the Actis blog, the Actis forum, put it in the comments there. Drop down into my LinkedIn profile and make a comment there. I do want to hear from you, and to hear Dr. Kennedy's response to that question, whether it's short or long or better for worse. Tune into the Actis radio show next week. I think that'll be good. It's always good. It's going to be an open mailbag question, just a whole lot of QA, which to me is probably the best kind of show. I like that better than the topical shows. All right, with that said, I'm not going to put a whole lot of time into this. I obviously didn't put on a suit. I'm not going to do a super amount of editing with it. The idea is to try to keep this low key, and who knows, maybe I can actually start making these more often, and keeping my promise to you to do that. And another thing that I would like for you to do is submit in the comments, or come over to my LinkedIn profile, or come to the Actis page, or email me, and let me know what are some questions that you have for the video, or some things that you would actually like to see me discuss. That could potentially make it easier for me to do it more often if I have requests for content, rather than trying to just think of something that might be interesting, to a handful of people. All right, with that said, I'm signing off. Thanks for viewing, and I'm not going to say hit the subscribe button because I'm doing these every week, but do hit the subscribe button, and we'll try.